Cool. I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us today. Welcome to CNCJ July's meetup event. My name is Harry Lee. I'm the organizer of CNCJ. Today we have Tom joining us, who will be showcasing Rancher. So just a few housekeeping items out of the way. This session is scheduled for 1 hour. However, we will leave the Zoom meeting open if people would like to continue their discussion afterwards. This session has a technicality rating of 2 out of 4. So there may be some Kubernetes terminology and is geared towards an audience that has some Kubernetes experience. Questions are always welcome, but please keep them on topic. As not to disrupt the session, Tom will answer your questions at the end during the Q&A session. We want to make this session as interactive as possible, so you will get a chance to speak. You can also ask your questions in the chat panel below. This session is being recorded and moderated, so please be respectful towards the speaker and your fellow participants. You will be kicked out if you do not abide by our code of conduct. This session will be available on YouTube and the official CNCF YouTube channel over the next 2 days. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tom to kick off today's presentation. Tom, would you mind sharing your screen? Cool. Awesome, Tom. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Harry. Hi, guys. My name is Tom Otomansky, and after Bradley done his demo last month around RKE, I thought I'd offer up the opportunity to demo Rancher server to you guys. So a quick introduction. I'm a container SRE working for APSA. I've been with APSA for the last 14 months. And we've been building a new platform to run the APSA Kubernetes estate on. As you guys can see, we also have a GitHub page where we share a few projects that have been open sourced. So if you guys want to, you can check that out. Previously, before I worked at APSA, I was working for F&B for just over 12 years, primarily as a VMware engineer, and worked on Windows servers before that. So with the times that we're in, I've thought I'd add this quote into my slide deck. I'm a big fan of Mark Twain, and I think with the current situation that we're in with Black Lives Matter and the COVID pandemic, I think it's something that we can all try and achieve. So what is Rancher Server? So Rancher Server is a product that was developed, open source product that was developed by Rancher Labs. It's an application that basically allows you to manage multi-cluster environments, Kubernetes environments. The product also allows you to spin up these Kubernetes clusters in multiple environments. So you can run clusters on bare metal, you can run them on VMware, you can also run them in public cloud. So it allows you to manage all of this from a central point. Rancher Server also has a centralized app catalog, which basically allows you to publish a catalog with applications via Helm charts. So you can have users go and request these applications and deploy them onto their clusters from this app catalog. It also allows you to create security policies and do compliance checks on Kubernetes clusters. You can also manage authentication and RBAC onto the Kubernetes clusters from from the UI itself as well. And because it's open source, it allows you to basically have the freedom to innovate. So Rancher Server is an open source tool, but it also doesn't limit you on what tools you can use to sort of bake into whatever methodologies or frameworks that you want to use. So if you want to use Jenkins as part of your CI/CD pipeline, or you want to run your own container registry, you can use that. It basically allows you to do that. Whereas other products might have those tools already baked in, and you don't have a choice in what tools you want to use. So it's very open to using other technologies or allowing you to use them. So with that, I wanted to give you guys a demo, and this presentation is going to be mostly a demo of Rancher Server and what it can do. There's going to be a lot of things that I'm only going to briefly touch on. Hopefully, we'll have some time to discuss any questions, but there's a lot of stuff that I'm just going to gloss over. There's a lot of resources that you guys can use that I'll share with you at the end of the presentation to get more info around it. So this is Rancher Server. At the moment, it's running on a AWS instance as a Docker container. If you're going to be running this in an enterprise environment, you'll probably want to use the RKE deployment. So the Rancher application can run as a Kubernetes pod backed by RKE, which was demoed by Bradley last month. So once you've logged onto the UI, you will be greeted with a global view. And as you can see, I've already pre-provisioned a couple of clusters here just to make things a bit more smooth. But what I'll demo first is creating a new cluster. So you can click on Add Cluster, and you can see there's a whole bunch of options that are available for you to deploy your cluster to. So you can deploy your own nodes and then add them. You can also import a cluster, so that's a pre-existing Kubernetes cluster, although this will limit the amount of functionality that you have within Rancher from a management point. You can also create nodes or have nodes created on a whole bunch of infra providers. So this would include your public cloud providers as well as some on-prem ones. And you can also choose a hosted Kubernetes provider deployment like EKS, AKS, and Google's GKE. Today I'm going to demo deploying on Amazon EC2. So we'll just create a new demo cluster. We'll just give this node pool a name. We're going to deploy one node, so we're going to have everything running on the single node. There's a node template that I'll go through with you guys just now. And then you basically choose what roles you want for your node. We're going to be running everything for now on the single node. So we're going to tick all those options. And then when you scroll down, there's a drop down where you can choose the Kubernetes version that you want installed on this. Rancher usually supports the latest Kubernetes deployment, as well as I think 3 versions back or prior. So we can choose the latest 1.18 at the moment. From a network provider, these are the options that are available from the UI. We're going to be using Canal. This is a combination of Calico and Flannel. And with this enabled, or with this option selected, it allows you to do project network isolation. So Rancher has a concept of projects. And this basically allows you to bundle multiple namespaces that have applications that would be communicating with each other or sharing resources between each other together in sort of one container. And enabling project network isolation basically allows you to limit communication between namespaces. So anything or any namespace that's in the same project, pods in those namespaces will be able to communicate with each other, but they won't be able to communicate with pods outside of that project. And then we'll just choose the Amazon cloud provider. So this option basically allows you to utilize features like deploying or having PVCs created and using Amazon's ELB as a layer 4 load balancer for your ingress. I'll go through all the available options in a bit. I just want to get this cluster going. So with all of this selected, you can already go and hit create, and the cluster is going to start provisioning. So while that's busy creating the node and deploying it and installing Kubernetes, some of the options that I wanted to show you, if we go here, so there's also the option to add a private registry. So if you're running a private registry like Harbor, for instance, or Key on-prem, you can go and add it here. You can just click on enable and you can point it to a private registry so that you're able to pull images from a private registry instead of going out to Docker Hub. Under the advanced options, you can choose whether you want to enable or disable the default Nginx ingress controller. This is the normal default Nginx ingress controller that comes with Kubernetes. You can also choose to enable or disable pod security policies. If you choose to enable it, you can also specify which will be the default. So if you want to make sure that all of your projects and namespaces, when they are created and pods get deployed there, that the pod security policy is applied on them by default, you can choose that. You can also specify a specific Docker version if you want to. If you'd like to keep track of what Docker versions you're running, so you don't have a whole bunch of different Docker versions on your clusters. Sorry about that. Then you can choose to specify that, yeah. You can also choose to have your SCD snapshots going to S3. If you don't choose that option, then they'll get stored locally on the nodes, on the master nodes. If you select the S3 option, then obviously you have to make sure that you've pre-created your S3 bucket and populated the info with all the access keys. And then with Rancher version 2.4, which is the latest release, they've added the ability to schedule CIS scans. These are scans that go and run against your cluster to make sure that it's abiding by the CIS benchmarks. These are security benchmarks to make sure that your cluster is running in a secure fashion. So you can go and enable these scans. And then the last section is when performing tasks that would cause maintenance on your nodes, you can go and specify how many worker nodes can be available when doing these maintenance tasks, and you can also choose whether you want nodes to be drained or not when doing these maintenance tasks. So that's things like doing a Kubernetes version upgrade. And then the last point is authorized endpoints. Authorized cluster endpoints are basically a way to connect to your Kubernetes clusters that you've provisioned directly. By default, when you download the kubeconfig file from Rancher and you connect to your cluster, you're doing that through the Rancher API. So it's the server that you are connecting to. And this API server proxies those requests down to your cluster. When you have this setting enabled, it also allows you to connect directly to your cluster, your Kubernetes cluster, bypassing the Rancher API. In the event that the Rancher API becomes unavailable for whatever reason, then you can still manage your cluster directly. So those are the cluster settings that you can configure. These network provider options also are just the ones that are available by default. You can edit the cluster settings in YAML and specify other network providers that aren't listed there. Those are just the providers that Rancher supports out of the box. And then the last thing I wanted to show you guys from a cluster point is the node template. So the node template that you guys saw there when I was creating the pool is basically a way to specify what spec that node is going to be provisioned and where it's going to be provisioned. So as you can see, the node template basically specifies that it's going to be in EC2. It gives the region and location, so which AZ it's going to be deployed in, and the general spec. So it's a T3 medium right now, and you can obviously create multiples of these. So if you want your master nodes to be a bit bigger than your worker nodes, you can go and specify that. You can have different node templates. And there we go. The cluster's done creating. So this is a fully working Kubernetes cluster. So what we're going to do now is we only have one node and it's got all the roles attached to it at the moment. So let's say you've had a developer that went and deployed their non-production app onto here, and they decided they've gone live with the app now. As it always happens, you know, something that's non-production suddenly becomes production. So what Rancher allows you to do is to basically add a second node, which is what we're going to do now. You can edit the cluster. Let's create a second node pool. Let's call this worker. Add a second node, and we'll give it just the worker role. And when we go hit save, we'll see that it's going to start provisioning a new node with a worker role, and it's going to add it into the Kubernetes cluster. So while that's busy provisioning the extra node, one of the nice features with Rancher is the ability to take a etcd snapshot on demand. So from the UI, you can just go and, for instance, choose a snapshot. This will go and create a snapshot depending on the location that you've specified. So if you haven't chosen an S3 bucket, it'll create those snapshots locally. When you open up the cluster and go to the snapshots view, you'll see that there's a snapshot name. And this cluster provision, so we can demo a Kubernetes version upgrade. So usually upgrading Kubernetes can be quite daunting. With Rancher, it becomes very simple. I pre-provisioned this cluster on a lower version of Kubernetes. So in order to upgrade it, you just edit the cluster, go to the drop-down, choose the Kubernetes version that you want to go to, hit save, and it's going to start updating the cluster. If you go to the node view, you'll see that the Kubernetes upgrade is going to start running. Rancher has developed quite a lengthy process to try and make sure that your applications stay up and running as much as possible. So there's, I mean, their goal is to basically make a Kubernetes upgrade with zero downtime on your application, and they've worked quite hard to get to that point. I think the few tests that I've done so far is very promising. So the applications stay running quite well. So while that upgrade is happening, let's go back to our newly provisioned cluster, and we can just wait for this worker node to come up. The one other thing I forgot to mention is obviously you can see this goes and updates all the components required for Kubernetes. So it goes and updates etcd, updates the kubelets, updates the kube API server, the kube proxies on all the nodes. So it goes in a staggered fashion. So it'll go and update etcd on the first node, make sure that it's up and running, and then it'll do the second node, it'll do the third node, and so on. And then it'll start working on the worker nodes. And this is all automated, so you can basically leave it to run in the background. So we've got our new worker node, and what we would like to do now is to remove the worker role off this node that we originally provisioned with all 3 roles, so that it only runs etcd and the control plane roles. Again, it's as simple as editing the cluster, unticking the worker role, saving the class, saving the cluster settings, and let Rancher work it out. This should only take a small bit to finish up. And then one of the other things that we're going to do, since we have now made this a production cluster, one of the things that we always want to do is not have etcd run on a single node, which means we'd want to run 3 nodes so that we always have a proper, fully functioning HA Kubernetes cluster. And one of the cool features to do that is just clicking on the plus sign there, and it'll provision 2 extra master nodes. It'll install etcd on there and all the control plane nodes and add them into Kubernetes. So while that's busy running, from the Rancher UI, you have the ability to launch the kubectl CLI. So from the UI, you can basically run all the kubectl commands that you're used to when managing Kubernetes environments. So you can see this is while the Kubernetes upgrade is running, we're still interacting with the Kubernetes API. Another thing that you can do is generate the kubeconfig file, so we can export this. Like I mentioned, the direct way for interacting with your Kubernetes cluster will get proxied through the Rancher API, but you'll also see that there's a direct connection to the nodes, the master nodes of your cluster, in the event that the Rancher API isn't available. So you can copy that. You can create a YAML file on your local machine. Let's just copy that again. Okay, let me make sure. There we go. Export it. And then you can run see, I think I've copied something I shouldn't have. Let's just copy it again. There we go. If we run a kubectl command, we can manage this from our local machine. So there's multiple ways of interacting with your cluster. One other thing that you can do in the event that you start seeing some or other issue on one of your nodes on the cluster, you can go and download the keys, which I've done already for this environment. I think it was for this environment. And you can basically, once you've downloaded the keys, you can SSH directly onto the nodes to see what the issue is. So it'll create a zip file of all the keys. I'm running Rancher OS on my nodes. So I'm using the user Rancher to get onto the node, and there I've managed to SSH onto the worker node. And we can see the Docker containers that are running on that node. Another cool feature is the ability to enable logging. So this basically allows you to ship your cluster and your container logs to an external logging provider. So you can basically just choose which logging provider you want to use. And once you've added in all the settings that's required for it, you can hit save, and it'll create a logging forwarder deployment on the cluster that will basically ship all the logs to your logging provider. So you can, for instance, if you're running a ALK instance, you can go and ship your logs to Elasticsearch, and then you can view your cluster and your application pod logs from that ALK instance. Another feature that Rancher brought out in version 2.3 is the ability to deploy Istio into your cluster. So you do that by going into Tools and clicking on Istio. You can choose the version that you want to deploy. Enabling monitoring is required for deploying Istio. This deploys Prometheus into the cluster as well. and you can basically just specify the reservations and limits that you want for each of the components for Istio. I'm just going to leave them on default. And I'm not going to create an ingress gateway, but you can choose to create an ingress gateway and specify whether you want to use node port or the load balancer option for it. And then you can also provide extra settings if you want to customize your Istio deployment more than the default deployment. So once you hit enable and you go to the system project, this is where all the sort of Kubernetes main components run. So you can see that the Prometheus operators are being deployed at the moment. And we'll see the Istio components getting deployed as well. And this is going to basically deploy a fully functional Istio into the cluster. About a minute or so. So while Istio is busy deploying, another feature that Rancher added recently is the ability to run the CIS scans, which I explained earlier. You can access the CIS scans from the tools menu. I ran a couple of scans. You can also do these on demand if you want to make a change and then see if it's taken effect. This basically generates a report that you can open and you can download, so you can see which portions of the CIS scan you failed, which ones were skipped, which ones were passed. And you can also see on which nodes it ran and where it failed. There's two sets of CIS scans, hardened and permissive. Permissive skips a few of the tests that Rancher have deemed sort of not critical. The hardened CIS scan includes everything that's documented in the CIS benchmark. So this basically covers everything that's mentioned in it. Let's go back to our cluster where we were deploying Istio. So we can see the Prometheus operator has been deployed and Istio has been deployed as well in the cluster. One of the easy ways to see that Istio has been deployed is you'll see there's a new enable Istio auto injection. So you can choose a namespace, click on enable Istio auto injection, and it'll basically allow for the deployment of Istio into, or the sidecars into this namespace. If you also go into the project, you'll see that there's a Istio section that gets generated. You also have access to all the UIs for the different tools that come deployed with Istio. So that's Kiali, Jaeger, and Grafana. So you can view those UIs and consoles directly from there. So before I go into the next section, Harry, I'm not sure if there's any questions from anybody at the moment.
Just checking the chat panel. Not at the moment.
Okay, awesome. So I mentioned during the slides the app catalog. So if you click on the apps tab, there's a launch button. And this basically goes and connects to a whole bunch of application catalogs. These are all Helm charts that are presented to you as a user, so you can go and deploy any of these applications onto one or more of your clusters. So we can go, for instance, deploy PHP, a bulletin board. Let's give it a name. We're going to deploy this into 2 clusters. So I've got a deployment project that we can go and deploy to. We'll just give it a password, and we'll use Noteport as the service type so we can access it without having to configure any ingress. And we can leave the rest as default. Hit launch, and we'll see that it's deploying the application into 2 clusters. And these can be clusters running on, one of them can be running on-prem, one of them can be running in public cloud. So it's a very neat way of deploying an application into multiple environments at the same time. So from here, you can see the endpoints have been created. So these are node ports. You can see the MariaDB instance being deployed and our PHP image also being deployed. If we go and check in on the other cluster, we can see the same. So once these come up, we should be able to connect to the PHP BB endpoint. So there's the endpoints created. Since we don't have any TLS stuff set up, the HTTPS link is not going to work, but we should be able to hit this node port. So if we just click on that, it should open up the forum page. So that's on the first cluster, and you can see that it's finished deploying. We go check on the second cluster. We can also check to see which endpoint's the non-secure one. And we can open that. So I did have this during my testing as well. From here, we can check the deployment. We can view the logs of the pod, so we can see if there's any issues. You can also execute a shell into the pod. It's obviously crashed now, so you won't be able to. But we can just choose to redeploy it. We'll just give it a minute or so to redeploy. Okay, so MariaDB is up. Let's just wait for, there we go. So it was that simple to deploy a single app into multiple clusters. And you can obviously, if you have 20 or 30 clusters here, you can deploy this application into those clusters. If you want to, for instance, upgrade this because it's running off Helm, at the moment there's only this specific version, but for other apps, there might be other versions that come out. So you can do upgrades to your applications using this as well. So it's quite a handy feature for deploying applications to multiple environments. And the catalog is basically where you specify where you want to pull the Helm charts from. You can also host this internally if you want. So if you have your own charts that you want to publish, you can obviously just host the Helm charts on a local server, and you can add them as a catalog into here, and you'll be able to publish your apps through here for your users to consume. The last section that I want to go through is the security section. So this is where you can configure authentication. So Rancher has the ability to add authentication providers such as Active Directory, LDAP, Azure AD, ADFS. So those are the Microsoft ones. You also have the ability to add GitHub as an authentication provider and a few others, Keycloak, Google Authentication as well. Once you've done that, you can then basically modify the permissions that your users have. You can either do this per user, or you can also manage them per group. So you can assign a global group and basically grant them access to the environment. The way that you do this is a feature called roles. This is tied into Kubernetes cluster roles, but it also works on a larger scale since Rancher manages multiple clustered environments. They have to have a global role. So this basically allows you to configure admins for only specific clusters or for the whole environment. Roles for clusters. So these are similar to the cluster roles that you get within Kubernetes. These are all built-in predefined roles that Rancher defines. You can obviously go and create your own if you want. You can basically add your own resources, specify the API groups. You can choose which verbs you want them to have and create that role, and you can apply these on your clusters. And then the last sort of set of roles is for projects. So this will only give these permissions onto the actual Rancher project, which is a grouping of namespaces. So the users won't have access directly onto the cluster. So if you want to, for instance, give your developers access to only create their own projects and namespaces and deploy their apps, but you don't want them to have the ability to go and, for instance, scale up or scale down their clusters or do Kubernetes version upgrades and cluster level changes, you can do that by just giving them a project role. And the last feature is pod security policies. So this basically allows you to create your own custom pod security policy. So if you have certain requirements or regulations that you need to abide by, especially in sort of enterprise environments, you can go and create your own pod security policy. So you can choose what settings you want to enable or disable in the pod security policy. And once you've created that pod security policy, you can then go and apply it on one of your downstream clusters. So any of these clusters, you can go and apply those policies, or if you're creating a project, there is a drop-down section when you have pod security policies enabled on your cluster that basically allows you to choose it. So as you guys saw, this is a very easy way of managing multiple Kubernetes environments. It's very easy to also manage Kubernetes versions, upgrades, cluster expansions, so you can scale up and scale down your environments a lot better than having to do this manually. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't been able to go too much in depth, but there's definitely a lot of resources available. So if I just go back to my slides, if you guys have more or are looking for more info, Rancher has a lot of documentation on their websites where they pretty much publish everything that you need to know to deploy your own environment. Rancher also has their own blog where they publish a lot of blog posts on doing things. So, you know, things like deploying, you know, ALK stacks to do monitoring and logging. There's a whole bunch of interesting info, and it's not all specifically Rancher related stuff that they publish there. They also have a Kubernetes masterclass, so that's their webinar sessions that they run covering a wide range of topics, which if you want to get more of an understanding on Rancher Server, I definitely recommend checking out. I know Bradley in his session also mentioned Rancher Academy. This is sort of Rancher's version of certification. If you go and do their first course that they've published, you should basically be able to go and deploy your own Rancher environment and understand how to manage it. So they've done quite a good job on including that sort of bit of work into a course that you can do yourself. Rancher Labs also have a YouTube channel where they post all of their webinars. So if you happen to miss one of them, you can always go and find the recordings on there. And then they also have a user Slack where you can post questions. There's a ton of people. I think they have like over 10 or 13,000 users there on their user Slack, where everybody basically posts their questions if they have any. And with that, I'm done on my side. If you guys have any questions, I'm sure we can take them now. And you guys can also hit me up on LinkedIn if you have any further questions.
Cool, awesome. So thanks, Tom, for a fantastic demo. So the amazing thing about this demo is that all the Kubernetes configurations that you have done is actually through the web browser. So configurations such as your pod security policy, CIS scanning, the tracing, service meshes, which conventionally needs fiddling in a terminal, but you actually just showcase like everything through a GUI. So that is actually amazing. You can essentially live in GUI land for all of your Kubernetes needs. So I think this actually lowers the barrier to entry for people who's just starting out with Kubernetes, where they just want to learn Kubernetes, just want to play around with Kubernetes. I think this is a very, very good way to start. So we do have two questions I see over here. So the first one is from David. So he says, great stuff, Tom. Which authentication providers can I use on Rancher? So I think you've mentioned this just now.
Yep. So I can maybe pop out here Just go back to my demo environment. So these are the ones that are available from Rancher. So Active Directory, Azure AD, ADFS, GitHub, Ping, Keycloak, Okta, Shibboleth, FreeIPA, OpenLDAP, and Google. You can also use local authentication, which is what I'm using at the moment. So if you don't have any authentication methods, you can still use local authentication.
Yeah. By local, you mean just like a text file with your username and password?
Yep.
Okay, great. Cool. So the second question is from Shakes. So the question is, in the enterprise environment, so if you have a dedicated team who configures Rancher, as a developer who deploys apps to Rancher, do I need Rancher OS or Rancher on my local machine?
No. So you basically interact with your cluster like you would if it was spun up on, let's say, Google Kubernetes engine or AKS. You can connect to it using kubectl. So you don't need any specific tools except for kubectl. That's in the backend. Rancher, all it does is it manages native Kubernetes. So in the backend, it's all native Kubernetes that's running there. So you can run the same native Kubernetes commands you would do, whether it's on GKE, AKS, OpenShift 4 even. You can run the exact same commands against your cluster here. In the backend, it's all native Kubernetes.
Okay, awesome. So if you guys have any questions that you would like to ask, you can just drop it in the chat panel and we'll address them. Or you can just unmute yourself and ask Tom directly. So I see.
There is one.
Yeah.
So there's one other thing that I wanted to add, which I forgot to mention. So Rancher does have an API as well that you can interact with. So a lot of the sort of the components have the ability to be manipulated via the API. So you can view the objects in an API. Rancher also has a CLI that they provide. So if you actually scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's a CLI that you can download. This basically allows you to interact with your cluster and your projects through the CLI. But like I mentioned, this isn't a requirement. You can connect to your cluster directly using kubectl, and that should work just fine. It's just some of the components like scaling nodes and things like that may require the actual Rancher CLI to run. And then they also have a Terraform provider. So if you use Terraform to spin up your environment, Rancher does have a Terraform provider that allows you to deploy these clusters using Terraform in a more automated fashion.
Cool, awesome. So I see that David has another question. Can I deploy an application to multiple Kubernetes clusters with Rancher?
Yes, you can. So if you add it as a catalog and you've got a Helm chart for it, then you should be able to deploy it. So like I deployed this PHP demo app. It's running on, it was deployed to 2 different clusters. And these clusters can be, like I said, one could be running on-prem on a bare metal environment, and the other one could be running in Azure or in EC2. It doesn't really matter. It's up to you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tom. So
Sure.
if there are no other questions, I'm just going to end the recording here. So just an ending note, we're always looking for speakers to come and share with us their cloud native journey. So please reach out to me if you are interested. Okay, there we go. There is another question. So Daryl is asking, are there any limits to be aware of with Rancher?
So if you're deploying in an enterprise environment, then you should be running on the RKE deployment method. So Rancher, the application server, I think I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there's two deployment methods. You can either deploy it as a Docker container or as a Kubernetes pod running on RKE. In an enterprise environment, you want to be running on RKE, even if it's on one node at the beginning, because you can always scale out to a 3-node deployment very easily. And Rancher will always ask you to do that, especially when running on a production environment. There are certain limitations from a cluster point. So if we go and look at the Rancher documentation, they do specify how many nodes and I think it's clusters you can manage using each method, and what the specs are for that. Let me see if I can find it quickly. So there's hardware requirements. Oh yes, you can also now, as of Rancher 2.4, deploy it on a K3s cluster if you so choose. But there is documentation to basically highlight the deployment size, how many clusters and how many nodes, and the specs for your servers, whether they be physical or virtual. There's obviously a caveat once you hit 2,000 clusters and 20,000 nodes, but I think at that point you've got, you'll probably have other ideas. One thing to keep in mind as well is when you are deploying Rancher server, keep in mind that everybody, like I mentioned, is going through the Rancher API by default. So if you have a lot of connections going to the API, you might start seeing performance issues. So try and size your environment based on how many connections you're expecting to your clusters, because all the API requests going to these clusters are going to be proxied through the Rancher API, unless they're going directly to the cluster. But by default, it goes through the Rancher API. So that can become sort of your single point of failure if you if you're not careful. But other than that, Rancher has documented most of their limitations quite well.
Cool, great. Thanks, Tom. So thanks everyone for joining us today. The webinar recording will be online over the next 2 days, and we're looking forward to seeing you at our next month's CNCJ meetup. Have a great evening.